Thanks for staying with us. This is a special edition of Consider This. We're speaking to experts and activists to hear their voices amid the current political crisis in the country. Now, joining us on the line, we have Ahmad Fuad Rahmat, Assistant Professor with the School of Media, Languages and Culture at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Fuad, good evening. Welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today. Now, in the months leading up to the crisis and the collapse of the Pakatan Harapan government, you were observing how counter-narratives were being shaped. You know, they were all in opposition to what Malaysia Baharu stood for, things like democracy and institutional reform and others. What do you think were some of the anxieties that were expressed in these counter-narratives?
Well, the most pertinent one to what's happening now is the prevalent sense that Malays were somehow excluded in the reform agenda. The government wasn't really responding to their concerns, and that overall, other than some lip service, the perception was that Malay sentiment was something that could be neglected or made secondary. So every time some issue came up, it would kind of just lead to, polarization. So one after the other, from the Zakir Naik issue to the ANtiDAP inquest to Jawi, PPSMI. Every issue became racialized, and it just snowballed to this groundswell of sentiment that's leading to where things are today.
Fuad, we kind of expect the counter-narrative to come from those parties that lost, right? So the parliamentary opposition made up of PAS or made up of UMNO, leading that narrative, perhaps, organizing and mobilizing around the anti-ISID protests and such. But was it just the political parties, or was this a much more generalized anxiety coming out from just very ordinary people with no necessary political commitments?
Yeah. So I don't think they were orchestrating the sentiment. I think it was just something that amassed over time, and I think you have to factor in a weakening economy as one of the reasons for this. And let's not forget, a lot of Malays voted for Pakatan largely because of Mahathir. He was a symbolic presence in the opposition then, who could somehow carry the Malay agenda in the reform agenda. That did not happen, and I think they were disappointed, and you could just sense that they wanted changes, and they wanted their sentiment to be reflected, and this was what led to the by-election losses recently. So what's happening today is in a lot of ways responding to that. It was a kind of reading of the political temperature, and some of the opportunists felt that they could strike now because there was sentiment on the ground that legitimized this.
So could you give us some examples for it? I mean, specifically, what are these forums or platforms that have emerged in which these anxieties that you speak of, primarily from the Malay segments, society segments, that are being expressed? What platforms?
Sure. So if you just notice on YouTube, you'll find a noticeable presence of alternative media in Bahasa, actually. Now, they're not all pro-PAS or pro-UMNO, but they are, I guess I would safely say, pro-Malay in the sense that, they're all in Bahasa. They're actually giving a lot of attention to a lot of issues that I guess mainstream liberal media tend to neglect or ignore. For example, the restructuring of PPRs, right? PPRs are predominantly Malay populated, right? Or the mismanagement of tabung haji, or the fact that there was a sermon on Friday that told the Malays that they don't really have to go to Hajj if they can't afford it, which is contrary to what tabung haji was established. So some of the platforms are like TV per TV, for example, MH Online. I guess one can say by and large they're conservative, but they're responding to a need to be recognized. They're a need to be heard by a huge segment of the Malay population. If you just look at their views, a basic video can come up to 100,000 views easily, 200,000 views. Jom Channel is a bit more, I guess, pro-government or pro-last government, I guess, a little bit more pro-Pakatan. But overall, they're giving a lot of the dissatisfaction among the Malay masses some kind of platform where they can kind of be heard and organized and stuff like that. So, we tend to think of freedom of expression as a kind of a liberal agenda, but if you just kind of apply what's going on in these platforms along those lines, you kind of see that this is an exercise of, free expression. Obviously in a very ethnocentric way, but they're using new media to be heard.
Fuad, and in your observations, are you seeing that the content is increasing or the viewership is increasing? I mean, is it the supply or the demand?
I would say both. I think what's happened since 2018, since Malaysia Baharu, is that, the Malay populace largely, they do not have leadership. But there is a lot of dissatisfaction, and it's materializing into these platforms where they can just discourse with each other. So there's a vibrant comment section. There's a lot of analysis that goes on in these platforms, and they're not necessarily by political leaders. They're by various NGO figures, but they're touching on a particular, I guess, need for a leaderless political bloc to just air out their grievances. So it becomes a way in which the community can kind of see themselves in the mediascape, as it were. So,
Fuad, I understand that the anxieties often need a target, right? And it seems like over the last 18 months or so, the DAP has become the kind of lightning rod for much of this criticism. But couldn't the narrative have been different? I mean, couldn't the narrative also have been that the previous administration, UMNO, the leadership that was corrupt and so on and so forth, allegedly corrupt, was the cause of the current miseries? I mean, why did it have to go in the way as it were against Pakatan as opposed to against UMNO?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, this is something I'm still trying to wrap my head around too. But in a sense, the anti-DAP sentiment, is irrational and I think exaggerated and misplaced. But that is, I would say, one fraction of the broader set of anxieties. I think it's you get to think of it as a mishmash of bad feelings, and DAP just happens to be mixed in there. But occasionally there are pertinent issues that these platforms would raise, concerns about political security, concerns about whether or not their identity can be properly represented there rather than just having some token figures at the highest level. They want to talk more about representation in the economy, in the school institutions, in education, and they don't feel that this is being represented enough, Right. But the anti-DAP sentiment is usually animated more at a political level, where, parties are bargaining for power and stuff like that. But on a more everyday sense, granted there's suspicions against DAP, but that's really a fraction of the broader set of concerns that these platforms are airing out. So it's not always well articulated, but it does hit on something very relevant, and that's the fact that a huge population feel disenfranchised despite being the majority. It's a conundrum.
Yeah.
The liberals haven't really gotten
Well,
around to.
I completely hear you, Fuad, and I'm just wondering, based on your experience, you founded Project Dialogue, which is all about developing intercultural understanding. So what strategy do you think could exist for either the former Pakatan Harapan or government or civil society organizations? What can they do to adopt, what strategies can they adopt to address some of these anxieties that we've been talking about?
I think there must be a savvier and grounded approach to public relations. I think there must be a way of adopting a certain idiom that resonates with this I guess atmosphere, as it were. I think it's not. I think it's not merely about delivering certain policies. It's a way of building relationships. It's a way of assuring that needs to happen. At the highest level. So it's a question of political communication more than policies or positions necessarily, because the media sphere is very, very complicated. You just can't So there must be a way of thinking about how we can package the messaging more effectively using an idiom that the Malay populace will resonate with, you know. So and that hasn't been attempted by the previous administration, unfortunately. I think their strategy was just to put some Malays in power, and hopefully the Malay populace will kind of sign up with it. But that apparently wasn't enough. You know, there must be a way of assuaging that can go on in deeper ways. Now, I do want to add too that if you kind of locate this globally, I would position this alongside the broader wave of the rise of the right wing in liberal democracies. The sense that culture and community are significant political idioms. And the liberal project cannot somehow accommodate this, because the liberal project is very state-centered, law-centered, and not necessarily community-centered. I'm obviously giving a very simplified dichotomy here. But if you just look at the rise of conservatism in Europe, the rise of conservative politics globally, there is this push towards more community-oriented politics. There's a push towards a more political project of belonging, and that's what the right wing is speaking to, and that's why it's effective, because there's a groundswell of disenfranchisement that they are recognizing and working on. I feel that what's happening in Malaysia is resonating with that broader trend, especially online.
Yep. It's that part of this global, I guess, move towards the right wing. Thank you so much, Fuad, for joining us this evening and sharing those insights. Now we're going to take a quick break. Come back to Thomas Fan, who's still in the studio with us, the chairperson of Bersih 2.0. Next on Consider This. Stay tuned.